George English here again, Director of Research Through People. So in looking at the Mayflower, last time we looked at how the Reformation unfolded in England. What we're going to do this time is look at its effects in a couple of other countries and then at the Separatists themselves. So of course another part of Britain is Scotland to the north of England, and we briefly mentioned John Knox beforehand. So the initial effect in Scotland was much the same as elsewhere. Luther's books were banned and his heresies, a popular word in those days about things you didn't agree with, suppressed. And John Knox developed, and interestingly enough, in the reign of Edward VI, 1549, John Knox actually was in the Church of England, and he was a royal chaplain to Edward VI himself. And he was a friend of the Hickmans, and the Hickmans would be people who would actually help the Separatists towards the end of the 16th century. But in other words, there were circles which he mixed in. And then when Mary came on the throne and started persecuting Protestants, Knox went over to Geneva and was there with John Calvin for 5 years, and obviously very heavily influenced by his teachings. And Queen Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, and it may have been possible that John Knox would actually have gone back to the Church of England, but he'd just written a treatise called The Monstrous Regiment of Women, which was career limiting. Queen Elizabeth wouldn't have anything to do with him. And so he went to Scotland, where very soon after 1560, he helped to found the Church of Scotland, which was based on the Calvinist Protestantism, and that became the national religion called Presbyterian. Now, we've mentioned Spain earlier on, and like England, Spain had two monarchs for most of the 16th century. Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. Spain was in a very powerful country. He inherited the Kingdom of Spain in 1516 through various mother and father. And then the Spanish Inquisition, we've probably heard of. Charles V started that in 1522, particularly to persecute the Protestants. And then in 1535, this edict condemning all heretics, particularly Protestants, to cut out the root of the evil with vigor and rude handling. And 50 to 100,000 people were killed, particularly in the Spanish Netherlands and elsewhere, by Charles. And then his son, Philip II, took over from him in 1556. And Philip II then was married to Queen Mary of England. But she died very soon after, and he was ruling the 17 provinces of the Spanish Netherlands, when in 1581 the Dutch provinces, what we now know as Holland, declared independence and gradually moved away from the Spanish and their persecution. In 1588, he sent the Spanish Armada to try and conquer England, and that, as we know, failed, and the Spanish fleet was decimated. A number of them went around the north of England, around Scotland, and suffered in many ways, etc. But Spain was then the most powerful country in Europe. And one of the effects of them persecuting the refugees, the Protestants in the Low Countries, was that a lot of them fled across to England, and Henry VIII welcomed them in from the 1530s. And then when Edward VI was on the throne, the first Strangers' Church was opened in London in 1550. And in fact, there was a French-speaking church in Austin Friars, and a Dutch one opened soon after, so the refugees could attend church services in their own language. Another one was opened in Glastonbury, but then Queen Mary came on the throne in 1553, and nothing else happened for a while. But after Queen Elizabeth came back on the throne, gradually a whole number of Strangers' churches were opened in the south of England. We'll do that one again. And a very important thing was the refugees bought their textile skills. Textiles was very strong in Flanders, and that became a very attractive element of the refugees. And we'll look at what happened in Canterbury as an example of this, and later on we'll look at what happened in Norwich. And just in passing, Scotland, very few refugees actually went to Scotland. They actually authorised that there be a strangers' church there later on in 1594, but it never actually happened. So if we look at the strangers' church in Canterbury, the people in Canterbury saw a lot of the refugees in Sandwich and actually went there and invited them to bring their textile skills to Canterbury. And they were given the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral, that was underneath Canterbury Cathedral itself, for their French Protestant church. And the numbers were very substantial. So there we are in 1592, out of a population in Canterbury of 9,000, over a third were in fact these refugees who came, particularly from the French-speaking part of Flanders, which was the southern part of Flanders. Now the Separatists, as they're known, and the word spell says, they wanted to separate from the Church of England. Elizabeth's middle way was not strict enough for them. They were Puritans, and so they wanted to separate from the Church of England from the 1580s on. And there were actually 3 separatists executed in 1593. So it wasn't an easy course, even in those days. And geographically, they were based in the north of Nottinghamshire and just over into Yorkshire and Lincolnshire to the east. And there were 2 churches in particular, one at Scrooby, one at Gainsborough, who met, and they had secret meetings, particularly after King James came on the throne. Now, there are other places here which are associated with the story. John Robinson, we talk about, he was born in Sturton-le-Steeple. William Bradford was born in Austerfield, and there was a church at Babworth. So this is something you can go and do a tour of the separatist locations in this part of the world. So the congregations met in secret. When King James came on the throne, they decided to leave the Church of England and flee to somewhere else where they could practice and worship freely. So in 1607 they tried, but they were betrayed and captured for a few weeks and put in prison. But then the following year they tried again, and the men successfully fled from a place called Immingham to Amsterdam, and the women and children followed soon after. So looking at these places, Scrooby and Babworth, there was a preacher, Richard Clifton, who was a very impressive personality, and William Bradford and William Brewster, 2 people who would go to the New World and were very influential there. William Bradford was orphaned, and about 1602 he met William Brewster. They used to walk 7 miles to Babworth to hear Clifton. Changed days, eh? And the Separatists met secret in Brewster's Scrooby Manor, his own house, where Clifton was a preacher and John Robinson, we talk about in a moment, was the teacher. But then in 1606, Brewster and the others were harassed by the Archbishop of York, who owned Scrooby Manor, and they were imprisoned and fined in York. Gainsborough was owned by William Hickman. We mentioned earlier that John Knox actually knew the Hickmans, and they gave him shelter. Their preacher was John Smith, and there was a congregation of 60 to 70 people. And again, as the authorities cracked down, Smith and his followers resolved to emigrate to pursue their religious freedom. So Pastor John Robinson is the person who's most associated with the Pilgrims, the Separatists. And he actually went to Norwich in 1603. That's the year that King James took over. Now, Norwich was another strangers' church, and in 1565, the refugees were invited to bring their textile skills. And there was actually a Walloon, French-speaking, and Flemish strangers' church. At first, they held their services in the same room. By 1579, there was a population of 6,000 of these refugees among a population of 16,000. And interesting enough, Scotland eventually got some weavers to go to Scotland in 1601, just before John Robinson came to 1603. He would almost certainly have met the Dutch refugees while he was there, and that probably was the factor that most influenced the Separatists to flee to Holland. Robinson was removed from office for his radical views. in 1604 and went back to Scrooby, where he came from, where he got involved with the Scrooby Separatists. And he went with the Separatists to Holland and became their pastor. But when they left in 1620 to go to the New World, he stayed, and in fact he died there 5 years later. So briefly mention the other two important people. William Brewster. So he was born in Scrooby and established the Separatist church in his home in Scrooby Manor. And he was the church elder and went to Leiden and later to the Plymouth colony in the New World. Now, William Bradford, who was an orphan and was befriended by Brewster, he joined Clifton and the Separatists and was 18 when he went across to Holland. He went to New England, and the year after he became the Plymouth governor for more than 30 years. Very influential and important figure. And he wrote of Plymouth Plantation, which was a history of the Pilgrims over there and what happened to them, and is the main source we have and why we know so much about their lives over there. So just to finish, the Separatists, their beliefs are lined out here. And the reason they wanted to separate from the Church of England was they believed that the church had strayed beyond Christ's teachings, and particularly they were Puritans, they were stricter people. So the main points that they differed from were predestination. They believed that the godly were the ones that God would save, not everyone. They didn't believe in lots of sacraments. They had only two, baptism and the Lord's Supper. And they didn't believe in a great church hierarchy, popes and bishops and so forth, just a simple setup. And marriage, interestingly enough, they saw as being a civil, not a church affair for the procreation of children and to avoid adultery. And that's similar to what was pursued in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And we've debated whether they thought about possibly going to Scotland rather than to Holland. So that covers that period in history and sets the scene for the Separatists in Holland and then the voyage of the Mayflower. So look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.